When Will Smith was kicked out of first grade, no one expected his next move to shock everyone. This story will change the way you think about justice. Subscribe and post in the comments where you're watching from. Will Smith's schedule had been grueling, even by his standards. The weeks leading up to this flight had been packed with premieres, interviews, and charity events. Though fulfilling, the pace left him yearning for a break. Finally, with his last obligation complete, his team arranged for him to fly back home in first class, ensuring maximum comfort. Will was more than ready for this journey. He craved the calm it promised. As he packed his carry-on that morning, he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The noise of his career, cheers from fans, the constant hum of cameras, the demanding pace of meetings, seemed distant. Instead, he pictured the warm familiarity of home. His family waiting to embrace him, the laughter of his kids filling the air, and the serenity of an evening spent without the pressure of being a public figure. At the airport, the atmosphere was predictably chaotic, but Will handled it with his usual grace. Security guards cleared a path and fans gathered, phones in hand, hoping for a selfie. Will smiled for the cameras, exchanged a few kind words, and waved as he moved through the terminal. Despite the attention, he felt a twinge of exhaustion. His public persona was always on, and today he longed for the quiet he'd been promised. Boarding the plane, Will noted the warmth in the flight attendants' greetings. Their smiles seemed polite but lacked sincerity. There was something in their eyes, a hesitation he couldn't quite place. Shaking off the feeling, he found his seat by the window in first class, a space meant to exude exclusivity and ease. Yet, as he settled in, he noticed a subtle shift in the air around him. The passenger across the aisle avoided eye contact, burying his face in a magazine. Another passenger moved their bag pointedly further away, as if creating an invisible barrier. A slight, awkward nod was the only acknowledgement from the person seated next to him before they turned away. Will wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but these small moments began to chip away at his mood. When the flight attendant came by to take drink orders, she served everyone else in the cabin first. By the time she reached him, her demeanor was brisk, and she spoke as though she was in a hurry. He requested sparkling water and waited longer than seemed reasonable for it to arrive. Moments later, the woman seated beside him pressed her call button. When the attendant arrived, she gestured discreetly toward Will and whispered something inaudible. A few seconds later, the flight attendant returned to Will and said, almost apologetically, "It seems your neighbor would prefer to move. We'll find her another seat." Will offered a tight smile but said nothing. He turned his gaze to the clouds outside the window, choosing to let it pass. Still, unease lingered. These weren't just isolated incidents, they felt connected, deliberate, though no one said anything explicit. As the flight progressed, Will began noticing more subtle disparities. His requests, a blanket, a different snack, were either ignored or met with visible reluctance. Meanwhile, the other passengers in first class were given attentive service. A man seated across the aisle gestured toward his glass of champagne, and within seconds, a flight attendant was there to refill it. Will couldn't ignore the double standard. The moment that solidified his unease came when he overheard a conversation between two passengers. Though their voices were low, the words cut through the hum of the cabin. "With his kind of background," one man said, "you'd think he'd stick to private jets." The other chuckled. "First class isn't exclusive enough anymore." Will stiffened but didn't turn around. He focused instead on controlling his breathing. Years in the spotlight had taught him restraint. how to keep his composure even when every fiber of his being demanded a response. Still, the weight of those words stayed with him. They weren't just talking about him as a celebrity. They were reducing him to something less than everyone else in that cabin. It wasn't new. He had faced this kind of prejudice before, but it never became easier. Will glanced at the call button above his seat, but hesitated. What would he even say? That he felt uncomfortable? That subtle slights and coded language were eating away at his peace? He doubted anyone would take him seriously. These were, after all, small things in the grand scheme of a world filled with injustices. Yet, in this moment, they felt enormous. He decided to let it go. Closing his eyes, he leaned back in his seat and tried to focus on the music playing through his headphones. The smooth rhythm of jazz filled his ears, offering a brief escape. He thought about home again, his sanctuary where none of this mattered. But even the thought of his family wasn't enough to shake the feeling that had settled deep in his chest. This flight, which should have been a reprieve, was beginning to feel like yet another stage where he was expected to perform, smiling through discomfort, swallowing pride for the sake of peace. As the plane soared higher into the sky, Will resolved to remain patient. After all, he told himself, it was just a few hours. What he didn't realize then was that this experience would become the catalyst for something much bigger than himself, a movement that would challenge an entire system. But for now, he remained seated, looking out the window as the world below faded into clouds. The tension began to build not long after the plane reached cruising altitude. Will had managed to distract himself momentarily, flipping through the in-flight magazine and sipping from his long-delayed glass of sparkling water. He told himself to let it go, to enjoy the fleeting hours of solitude before he could be with his family. But peace would not come so easily. A flight attendant approached, her expression oddly strained. Will looked up, ready to offer the same polite smile he extended to everyone who interacted with him, but the words she spoke erased any pretense of calm. "Mr. Smith," she began, her tone careful yet lacking genuine warmth, "we've received some complaints from other passengers. For the comfort and safety of everyone aboard, we're going to need to move you to another seat." Will blinked, caught off guard. "Complaints?" he echoed, his voice measured. "What kind of complaints?" The attendant shifted uncomfortably. "It's just, some passengers feel uncomfortable. We ask for your understanding in this matter. It's about maintaining harmony on the flight." Will leaned back in his seat, the weight of her words settling heavily on his chest. "Uncomfortable?" he repeated, his voice lower now, tinged with disbelief. "What exactly have I done to make anyone uncomfortable?" Her gaze faltered, darting briefly to the other passengers in first class. No one met her eyes, or his. "It's not about you personally," she said, her words rehearsed and clinical. "It's simply a matter of accommodating everyone's needs." Will exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain composed. Years in the public eye had taught him how to navigate moments like these, how to maintain poise when dignity was under attack. But this wasn't a red carpet or an interview. This was an intimate violation, a stripping away of the very courtesy and respect every human deserved. "I paid for this seat," Will said, his tone firm but calm. "I'd like to know why I'm being asked to move." Her polite mask began to crack. "We really need your cooperation," she said, her voice quieter now, as if willing him to comply before the situation escalated. "If you refuse, I'll have to involve the captain." The mention of the captain hit him like a warning shot. He knew what it meant. Escalate this any further, and he'd risk being painted as the aggressor, no matter how reasonable his response. The headlines flashed through his mind. Will Smith causes mid-flight disruption. The fallout would overshadow the truth of the matter entirely. With every eye in the cabin now on him, some curious, others smug, Will made his decision. He nodded once, tightly. "Fine," he said, his voice clipped. "Lead the way." The attendant offered a strained smile of relief and gestured for him to follow her. Will stood, lifting his carry-on from the overhead compartment. As he moved past the rows of first-class passengers, he felt their stares burning into him. None of them spoke, but their silence said enough. They didn't need words to communicate their approval of his removal. The walk through the cabin felt agonizingly long. With every step, Will felt his pride chipping away, piece by piece. When they reached the economy section, the attendant gestured toward an open seat near the back of the plane, right by the lavatories. The smell of disinfectant lingered in the air, and the cramped quarters were a far cry from the spacious comfort of first class. "Here you go," she said, almost cheerfully, as though her tone could erase the sting of what had just transpired. Will slid into the seat, his broad shoulders barely fitting within the narrow confines. He placed his bag beneath the seat in front of him and leaned back, staring at the blank screen of the seatback monitor. Around him, the hum of chatter and the occasional cough filled the air, but his mind was elsewhere. A few passengers in economy noticed him. Some looked surprised, others confused. One man leaned over to whisper to his companion, and Will caught the faint sound of his name. But most people paid him little attention, too absorbed in their own journeys to wonder why a global superstar was seated among them. For a moment, he considered pulling out his phone and documenting the experience, recording a video, explaining what had just happened. But he stopped himself. He wasn't sure he could find the words without his voice betraying the anger and hurt that bubbled just beneath the surface. Instead, he closed his eyes and took a deep breath. His thoughts turned inward, grappling with the weight of what he'd just experienced. It wasn't just the personal humiliation that stung, it was the realization of how many people likely endured similar treatment every day, without the platform or privilege to fight back. How many others had been quietly moved, excluded, or demeaned under the guise of maintaining harmony. How many had been made to feel like they didn't belong. The words he'd overheard earlier echoed in his mind. First class isn't exclusive enough anymore. He thought about the unspoken rules that governed spaces like these, rules that had less to do with money or fame and everything to do with perceptions of worthiness, of who was allowed to exist comfortably in certain places. The seatbelt sign dinged, signaling turbulence ahead. Will opened his eyes, staring at the blinking light above him. He thought about his family, about the values he'd tried to instill in his children, kindness, resilience, and the courage to stand against injustice. Would he be able to look them in the eye and say he had lived by those principles today? As the plane shuddered slightly, Will made a quiet vow to himself. This wasn't over. He didn't know what form his response would take yet, but he knew he couldn't let this go. Not for himself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, invisible, or unwelcome. The flight continued, but for Will, it was no longer just a journey home. It was the beginning of something much bigger, though even he couldn't yet grasp just how far this moment would reach. The plane touched down with a jarring thud, the landing gear skidding along the tarmac as the aircraft slowed to a halt. Will felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. He had spent the remainder of the flight in near silence, his mind racing as he replayed the events that had unfolded. The humiliation, the passive stares, and the unspoken tension still hung heavy over him. Yet, as the plane taxied toward the gate, a new sense of determination began to take root. Exiting the plane was another trial. He waited until nearly all the passengers had left their seats, unwilling to endure the awkwardness of squeezing past those who had witnessed his forced relocation. When he finally stood, stretching his stiff legs, he noticed a few hesitant glances from those lingering in the economy cabin. Some seemed to recognize him, their eyes betraying curiosity or pity, but no one said a word. The airport terminal was bustling, a stark contrast to the sterile, confined atmosphere of the flight. Will pulled his baseball cap low over his face, trying to move unnoticed through the crowd. He didn't mind being recognized in most situations, but today he craved anonymity. The weight of what had happened pressed down on him, and he needed space to process it. Once inside the back seat of a waiting car, Will finally allowed himself to exhale. The driver, a cheerful older man, made polite small talk, asking about his trip and the weather. Will responded with the same ease he always mustered, but his thoughts were elsewhere. As the city blurred past the window, he reached for his phone, staring at the blank screen for a long moment before opening the camera app. The recording began with Will's face framed by the soft light of the car's interior. He paused for a beat, considering his words before speaking. "I wasn't going to share this," he began, his voice steady but tinged with quiet resolve. "But something happened on my flight today that I can't let go without saying something." He went on to recount the events, his tone calm yet firm. He avoided dramatic embellishments, focusing instead on the facts. The complaints from unnamed passengers, the vague explanations from the crew, and the degrading walk to the back of the plane. He didn't name the airline or any individuals, choosing instead to highlight the broader issue at play. "This isn't about me," he said, leaning slightly closer to the camera. "I've faced this kind of treatment before, and I'm sure I'll face it again. But there are people who go through this every day, people who don't have the privilege or the platform to call it out. And that's not okay. It's not okay for anyone to feel like they don't belong, whether they're on a plane, at work, or anywhere else." Will ended the video with a simple statement: "We've got to do better." He hesitated for a moment before hitting upload, watching as the video began to circulate online. Within hours, it became clear that his message had struck a nerve. The video spread rapidly across social media platforms, racking up millions of views and comments. The reactions were immediate and impassioned. Thousands of people shared their own experiences of discrimination and mistreatment, many expressing gratitude that someone as visible as Will was bringing attention to the issue. One comment read, "This isn't just a celebrity problem, it's everyone's problem. Thank you for speaking up, Will." Another shared a personal story. "I was kicked off a flight with my kids because they said the plane was overbooked. Funny how we were the only ones they chose to remove." Among the flood of responses, there were also skeptics and critics. Some dismissed his account as exaggerated or questioned why he hadn't taken private transportation. But Will didn't let those voices distract him. The overwhelming support and the stories pouring in from people around the world reaffirmed his belief that this moment mattered. The airline eventually responded with a statement, released through their social media accounts and major news outlets. It was brief and impersonal, referring to the incident as an unfortunate misunderstanding and offering a vague apology for any discomfort caused. The public's reaction to the statement was swift and unforgiving. People flooded the airline's posts with angry comments, accusing them of deflecting blame and refusing to address the underlying issue. The hashtag #DoBetter began trending, with users calling for more accountability and change within the industry. Will was deeply moved by the stories he read in the comments and private messages. Each one painted a picture of systemic inequality and disregard, far beyond his own experience. One message, in particular, stood out. A young mother detailed how her family had been removed from a flight under the pretext of overbooking. She described the humiliation of having to explain to her crying children why they couldn't go on their vacation. Her words resonated deeply with Will, reminding him that his ordeal was part of a much larger pattern. The response to his video made one thing clear. This wasn't just about a single incident. It was about a system that allowed such incidents to occur, unchecked and unchallenged. Will realized that he had an opportunity, perhaps even a responsibility, to do more than just raise awareness. He could help spark real change. The next morning, as he sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee in hand, he began making calls. The first was to a lawyer he trusted, someone who specialized in civil rights cases. The second was to a colleague in the entertainment industry who had long been an advocate for social justice. By the time he finished his third call, an idea had begun to take shape. Will didn't know exactly where this journey would lead, but he was certain of one thing. He wasn't going to let this moment pass without taking action. The video had been the first step, a view from above that revealed the scope of the problem. Now it was time to get to work. In the weeks that followed, Will Smith's life took on a new rhythm. His days, once filled with film scripts and promotional events, were now dominated by meetings with lawyers, activists, and industry professionals. His kitchen table became a makeshift headquarters, scattered with notebooks, legal pads, and his laptop, which constantly buzzed with incoming emails and video calls. He had crossed a line, stepped into a space where his fame alone wasn't enough. This was about building something real, something meaningful. The idea came to him late one evening, as he sifted through the countless messages he'd received since posting the video. Each story spoke of a shared pain. People of all backgrounds united by experiences of exclusion and mistreatment. He couldn't fix the past, but he could create something to address the future. Scribbling on a blank sheet of paper, he wrote 2 words: "In the sky for all." The phrase struck him as aspirational and actionable, a call to create a world where every traveler could feel safe and respected. The next morning, he gathered a small team of trusted advisors. Among them were a civil rights attorney, a hospitality expert, and a former airline employee who had reached out after seeing his video. Together, they began brainstorming the foundation of what would become the initiative. "We need to hear from the people directly," Will said, his voice steady but passionate. "Their stories are the heart of this. Let's create a platform where they can share what's happened to them, and where they can find support." The team quickly set to work, and within days, they launched a dedicated hotline and website. The hotline allowed individuals to report incidents of discrimination or mistreatment during travel, while the website served as a hub of resources. It offered advice on passengers' rights, legal support contacts, and step-by-step guides for filing complaints against airlines. The response was immediate. Calls flooded the hotline, and the website's servers struggled to keep up with the traffic. Will watched in awe as the movement began to take on a life of its own. What had started as a deeply personal moment of humiliation was growing into something much larger, a collective demand for accountability and change. The next step was to raise the initiative's profile. Will's team suggested hosting an event to bring attention to the cause, but he wanted something that would go beyond the typical fundraiser or press conference. He envisioned an experience that would embody the values of inclusivity and equality. That's when the idea for the dinner was born. "We'll do it on a plane," Will declared during a late-night meeting, his eyes lighting up with enthusiasm. "We'll transform it into a space that celebrates diversity, art, food, culture, everything. It'll be a symbol of what air travel should feel like for everyone." The logistics were daunting, but Will's determination inspired the team to push forward. They secured an aircraft from a charter company willing to support the cause and set about turning it into a flying art gallery. The walls were adorned with pieces from young artists of diverse backgrounds, each work telling a story of resilience and identity. The menu featured dishes from different cultures, designed to represent the global community that air travel connects. Will personally reached out to the guest list, which included victims of travel-related discrimination, activists, and industry representatives. He wanted the dinner to serve as a platform for dialogue, a space where stories could be shared and solutions could be discussed. The day of the event arrived, and the atmosphere aboard the transformed aircraft was electric. Guests marveled at the vibrant artwork, the carefully curated details that reflected the initiative's mission. As the plane remained grounded at a private hangar, the guests sat down to a meal unlike any other. The conversations around the table were deeply moving. A middle-aged woman spoke of how her family had been denied boarding after their seats were mysteriously reassigned. A young man shared his experience of being ejected from business class despite having a valid ticket, because another passenger had complained about his presence. The stories were raw and honest, each one highlighting the urgent need for change. When it was time for Will to speak, he stood at the front of the plane, looking out at the faces of his guests. He took a moment to collect his thoughts before beginning. "This isn't just about planes or policies," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's about people. It's about dignity. And it's about creating a world where no one has to wonder if they're being treated unfairly because of who they are." The applause that followed was thunderous, but it wasn't just for him. It was for the movement that everyone in that room was now a part of. The event's impact was immediate. Videos and photos flooded social media, accompanied by the hashtag #InTheSkyForAll. News outlets picked up the story, bringing even more attention to the initiative. The public's response was overwhelmingly positive, with many praising Will for using his platform to address such a critical issue. But it wasn't just the public that took notice. Several major airlines reached out to express interest in collaborating with the initiative. They offered to review their policies, implement new training programs, and even participate in forums to discuss industry-wide changes. It was a promising start, but Will knew there was still much work to be done. As the plane's lights dimmed and the last guests prepared to disembark, Will remained seated at one of the tables, a quiet moment of reflection washing over him. He thought about how far the movement had come in such a short time, and how far it still needed to go. This was just the beginning. What had started as a personal experience of injustice was now a collective mission to ensure that everyone, no matter their background, could feel safe and respected in the skies. Will knew the road ahead would be challenging, but he was ready to face it. The birth of the movement was complete. Now it was time to make it soar. The weeks following the dinner event brought a whirlwind of activity for Will and his team. The initiative, In the Sky for All, had gained momentum. But Will was acutely aware that visibility was only the first step. Real change required commitment, persistence, and collaboration. It was time to take the movement to new heights, both literally and figuratively. The idea for the next event came naturally. The dinner had been a powerful symbol, but Will wanted to push the boundaries further. If the goal was to reimagine the experience of air travel as inclusive and equitable, then the next step was to create an event that embodied that vision entirely. And so, the Flight of Equality was conceived. This time, the event wouldn't be confined to a stationary plane. Will's team worked tirelessly to charter a flight that would take off, circle the city, and land again. A journey not just through the skies, but through the possibilities of what the future could hold. Every detail of the flight was designed to reflect the values of the movement, from the guest list to the in-flight experience. The preparations were exhaustive. The team reached out to cultural organizations, social justice groups, and even local schools to source art and stories that would be featured during the flight. A group of poets and musicians was invited to perform live, ensuring that the flight itself would be an immersive experience. The menu, crafted by a team of chefs from diverse backgrounds, highlighted dishes from regions around the world, celebrating the cultural tapestry that air travel connected. Perhaps most importantly, the guest list was carefully curated. Alongside advocates, airline representatives, and media figures, Will extended personal invitations to individuals who had reached out to him with their own stories of discrimination. He wanted their voices to be front and center, their experiences the driving force behind the event. The day of the flight arrived with a buzz of anticipation. Guests gathered in a private terminal, greeted by Will and his team. The atmosphere was one of excitement, but also purpose. Many of those aboard in the plane had faced injustice in their travels. Today, they would reclaim that space. As the aircraft taxied down the runway, Will took a moment to reflect. Looking around the cabin, he saw faces full of hope, determination, and, for some, cautious optimism. The plane lifted off smoothly, and with it, the weight of what the event symbolized became clear. Once airborne, the cabin came alive with activity. Passengers admired the artwork adorning the walls, each piece accompanied by a story of resilience. A young poet stood at the front of the cabin, her voice steady as she recited verses about belonging and the pain of exclusion. The applause that followed was heartfelt, the sound filling the space like a balm. As the meal service began, conversations flowed freely. A young man shared his experience of being profiled at an airport, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. Across the aisle, a woman spoke of the time she and her husband had been removed from a flight, their seats given to other passengers without explanation. The stories were sobering, but the act of sharing them felt empowering. Will moved through the cabin, stopping to speak with guests listening intently to their words. He heard pain, yes, but also resilience and hope. The common thread in every conversation was a desire for change, not just in the skies, but in every corner of society where inequality persisted. As the meal service concluded, Will stood at the front of the cabin, a microphone in hand. The chatter quieted, all eyes turning to him. "When we step onto a plane," he began, his voice steady, "we're all equal at 30,000 feet. The clouds don't care about where we're from, what we look like, or how much we paid for our ticket. And yet, so often, our humanity is stripped away before we even take off." He paused, scanning the room. "But today, we're proven that it doesn't have to be this way. Today, this flight is a symbol of what's possible when we choose empathy, inclusion, and respect over fear and division." The cabin erupted into applause, but Will wasn't finished. "This movement isn't about me," he continued. "It's about all of us. It's about the stories we've heard today, the pain that so many people carry, but it's also about the hope we're building together. This isn't the end of the journey. It's just the beginning." As he sat back down, a passenger across the aisle leaned over. "Thank you," she said softly, "for making us feel seen." The plane began its descent, the city lights twinkling below. As the aircraft touched down, the cabin was filled with a sense of quiet triumph. Guests disembarked with renewed purpose, many exchanging contact information, promising to stay connected. Videos and photos from the flight quickly spread online, the hashtag #FlightOfEquality trending within hours. The public's response was overwhelming, with many praising the event as a groundbreaking step in the fight for equality. Airline executives reached out, offering to discuss policy changes and new training programs for their staff. For the first time, it felt like the industry was beginning to listen. But for Will, the real victory was the connections forged during that flight. The stories shared, the courage displayed, a solidarity that grew stronger with every passing hour. The Flight of Equality wasn't just an event, it was a declaration of what the future could be. As Will watched the last guest leave the terminal, he felt a quiet satisfaction. The movement was gaining altitude, but he knew there was still turbulence ahead. Change wouldn't come easily. It never did. But for the first time, he felt certain that they were heading in the right direction. With the lights of the airport fading behind him, Will looked up at the sky. The stars were bright and unyielding, a reminder of the vast possibilities that lay ahead. This was just the beginning, and he was ready to keep flying. The success of the Flight of Equality catapulted the initiative into a new phase. What began as a response to a single moment of injustice had now grown into a national movement. Stories from travelers around the world continued to pour in, fueling the mission with a renewed sense of purpose. Will knew the challenge ahead wasn't just about addressing individual incidents. It was about dismantling the systems that allowed such inequalities to persist. The initiative's next focus was expansion. The hotline and website had become essential tools, but their reach needed to grow. Will and his team worked tirelessly to secure partnerships with advocacy groups, lawmakers, and even some progressive airline companies. They knew that lasting change required a multifaceted approach, addressing both policy and culture within the travel industry. One of the first steps was to create educational programs for airline staff. Will and his team collaborated with experts in diversity and inclusion to develop a comprehensive training curriculum. The goal was not just to check a box, but to foster genuine understanding and empathy among those who interacted with travelers every day. "We're not here to point fingers," Will said during a meeting with airline representatives. "We're here to build a better system for everyone." To launch the program, the initiative hosted a training pilot with the cooperation of one of the largest airlines in the country. Flight attendants, gate agents, and other airline employees attended workshops that blended lectures with role-playing scenarios designed to challenge their assumptions and biases. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with many participants expressing gratitude for the opportunity to learn and grow. The program's success prompted other airlines to take notice. Within months, several major carriers had signed on to implement similar training. It was a small but significant step toward creating a more equitable travel experience. As the initiative expanded, Will found himself increasingly moved by the personal stories that continued to reach him. One letter, in particular, stuck with him. It was from a young woman named Sophia, who wrote about her fear of flying after a traumatic experience of discrimination at an airport. "I used to love traveling," her letter read, "but after that day, I haven't stepped on a plane in years. Seeing what you're doing has given me hope that maybe, one day, I can feel safe in the sky again." Will carried Sophia's words with him, using them as motivation during the long, often grueling days of advocacy. He reached out to her personally, inviting her to attend one of the initiative's upcoming events. Her gratitude was palpable, and the connection served as a reminder of why this work mattered so deeply. The initiative's growing influence also began to attract attention in legislative circles. Will and his team worked closely with lawmakers to draft a bill aimed at protecting passengers' rights. The proposed legislation included measures to address discrimination, increase transparency in airline policies, and establish clear consequences for violations. The process was anything but smooth. Lobbyists for the airline industry pushed back fiercely, arguing that the proposed changes were unnecessary and burdensome. But Will refused to be deterred. He testified before Congress, sharing not just his own experience but also the stories of countless others who had suffered in silence. "This isn't about inconveniencing airlines," he told the committee. "It's about protecting people. It's about ensuring that when we step onto a plane, we're all treated with the dignity and respect we deserve." The testimony made headlines, sparking widespread public debate. Support for the bill grew, bolstered by grassroots efforts from individuals who had been inspired by the initiative. The hashtag #SkyRights began trending, as people shared their own stories and called on their representatives to act. Amid all this, Will found moments of solace in the letters and messages he continued to receive. One day, he opened an envelope containing a handwritten note from Sophia. "I flew for the first time in years," it began. "It wasn't easy, but I kept thinking about what you said, that change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with us. Thank you for giving me the courage to try again." The letter brought tears to Will's eyes. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. Sophia's words reaffirmed that the work they were doing wasn't just theoretical, it was changing lives. The culmination of the initiative's progress came at a national summit on passenger rights, hosted in Washington, D.C. Leaders from the travel industry, government officials, and advocates gathered to discuss the future of air travel. Will delivered the keynote address, speaking from the heart about the movement's journey and the road ahead. "This isn't just about flights," he said. "It's about creating a world where no one has to question their worth, where everyone has the freedom to move, to explore, to connect. We've come so far, but there's still work to do, and I promise you, we're not stopping here." The summit ended with a standing ovation, but Will's mind was already on the next steps. The movement had grown beyond anything he could have imagined, but he knew that the fight for equality required constant vigilance. As he left the stage, a young woman approached him, her face lit with determination. "Thank you for doing this," she said. "You've inspired so many of us to keep pushing for change." Will smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The movement was no longer just his. It belonged to everyone who had joined the fight. Together, they were broadening horizons, one flight at a time. Later that evening, as Will stood by the window of his hotel room, watching planes take off into the night sky, he thought about the journey that had brought him here. It hadn't been easy, and it wouldn't get easier, but for every Sophia, for every person who found the courage to reclaim their space, it was worth it. The horizon stretched endlessly before him, a reminder of all that still lay ahead. Will took a deep breath. his resolve unwavering. This was only the beginning. The skies belonged to everyone, and he wouldn't stop until they reflected that truth. The initiative, In the Sky for All, had grown far beyond anything Will could have imagined when he first recorded that video after his flight. What began as a call for justice had transformed into a national movement, with ripples spreading across industries, governments, and communities. Now, the task was to ensure the movement didn't just create a moment. It needed to create a legacy. The turning point came when Congress passed the Passenger Equality Act, a law inspired in large part by the stories collected through the initiative. The act introduced strict guidelines to prevent discrimination in the airline industry, mandated comprehensive staff training, and established clear accountability measures for violations. For Will, the passing of the bill was a monumental victory, but it was far from the end of the journey. The initiative began expanding its focus. Discrimination wasn't limited to the skies, and the team recognized the need to address inequities in other forms of travel and hospitality. Will launched a new branch of the initiative, aimed at combating systemic bias in hotels, rideshare services, and other sectors that shaped people's journeys. At the same time, the educational programs that had begun with a single airline were now being adopted across multiple industries. Hotels, car rental agencies, and even cruise lines reached out to the initiative, eager to implement the training that had garnered such praise. The program became a model for addressing bias, praised not only for its effectiveness, but also for its empathy-driven approach. Amid all this growth, Will remained deeply involved. He continued to meet with individuals who had been impacted by discrimination, listening to their stories and learning from their experiences. One day, he received an invitation to attend a community meeting organized by Sophia, the young woman whose letter had inspired him earlier. When Will arrived, he found a modest but packed room filled with people from all walks of life. Sophia greeted him warmly, her once nervous demeanor replaced with confidence. She had taken her fear and transformed it into action, organizing local efforts to support those who face discrimination while traveling. During the meeting, Sophia spoke passionately about how In the Sky for All had changed her perspective. "It's not just about airplanes or hotels," she said. "It's about creating a world where everyone feels safe, no matter where they go." Her words resonated deeply with Will. They reminded him of why he had started this journey, not just to address one injustice, but to challenge the deeper structures that allowed such injustices to exist. As the meeting concluded, Sophia handed Will a letter from a young boy who couldn't attend, but wanted to thank him. The boy wrote about how he'd seen his mother cry after being mistreated at an airport, and how, thanks to Will's initiative, he believed things could be different in the future. The letter stayed with Will long after the meeting ended. It was a reminder that every story mattered, every person mattered. He carried that thought with him as he prepared for what would be the initiative's most ambitious project yet: a global summit on equity in travel and hospitality. The summit brought together leaders from across the world, government officials, industry executives, activists, and everyday travelers. Held in a massive convention center, the event featured panels, workshops, and even virtual reality experiences that allowed participants to walk in the shoes of those who had faced discrimination. Will's keynote address was the centerpiece of the summit. As he stood before the crowd, his mind flashed back to the first time he had been asked to move to the back of that plane. The humiliation he'd felt then was now a distant memory, replaced by the profound impact of what had come after. "This movement started because of one moment," he began, his voice steady and resonant. But it grew because of all of you, because you were willing to share your stories, to demand better, to imagine a world where equality isn't just a promise, it's a reality. The audience erupted into applause, but Will wasn't finished. We've achieved so much together, but there's still work to do. The sky may be vast, but it's not infinite. We have to keep reaching, keep pushing, until everyone everywhere can travel without fear, without shame, and without barriers. The summit concluded with a sense of unity and determination. Attendees left with a renewed commitment to carry the work forward in their own industries and communities. The initiative had achieved what it set out to do, not just to create change, but to inspire others to do the same. As Will boarded his own flight home after the summit, he took a moment to reflect. The plane was the same as any other he'd flown on, but this time it felt different. He glanced around the cabin, noticing the diverse group of passengers settling into their seats. For the first time in years, he felt an unshakable sense of peace. The flight was smooth, the clouds outside the window stretching endlessly into the horizon. Will leaned back, closed his eyes, and let himself dream, not just of the skies, but of a world that truly belonged to everyone. The journey wasn't over. It never would be. But, for now, he allowed himself a moment to appreciate how far they had come. Together, they had reached new heights, and the future was brighter than ever. Thank you for watching and being part of this journey. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next powerful story we share. Dive into our other videos, where you'll find more tales that explore unique perspectives and challenge the way we see the world. And if you believe this message deserves to be heard, share this video with your friends, your family, and your community. Together, we can keep these important conversations alive and growing.